The day began like any other. I awoke to the soft hum of my wife Mia's voice in the kitchen, a tune she always hummed when she made breakfast. It was comforting, almost hypnotic, and it set the tone for mornings that felt more like rituals than routines. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through emails, noting the mundane updates from work and a message from my younger brother, Ethan. He had always been the star in the family. Charming, endlessly talented, and universally adored. Ethan's message was typical. A quick check-in, an offer to meet for drinks later in the week. I responded with a smiley face and a thumbs up before stepping into the shower, allowing the warm water to wash away the lethargy of sleep. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of bacon and freshly brewed coffee. Mia stood at the counter, dressed casually in one of my old sweatshirts, her hair still tousled from bed. She looked up, smiled, and handed me a mug. "You have that thing with Ethan this week, right?" she asked, her tone light. I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "Yeah, just grabbing drinks. It's been a while." She smiled again, though there was something about it that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was subtle, an almost imperceptible flicker of something I couldn't place. Dismissing it as my imagination, I settled into the routine of breakfast, Mia gliding through the room with her usual grace. We had been married for almost a decade, and though we weren't perfect, I always thought we worked well together. Sure, there were the occasional arguments and the typical ebbs and flows of a long relationship, but beneath it all was a foundation of trust, or so I thought. The first crack in that illusion came later that afternoon when I decided to clean out the attic. Mia had left to run errands, and I thought I might surprise her by sorting through the piles of junk we'd been meaning to organize. Among the boxes of old books and forgotten trinkets, I stumbled upon a shoebox labeled Memories. Curious, I opened it, expecting to find old birthday cards or maybe photos from our early years together. Instead, I found a stack of Polaroids. At first, they seemed innocent enough. Pictures of family gatherings, vacations, and celebrations. But as I flipped through them, my chest tightened. There, tucked among the harmless snapshots, was a picture of Ethan and Mia. They were standing too close, their faces too intimate. It wasn't a photo that screamed infidelity, but something about their expressions. The subtle tilt of her head toward his shoulder, the way his hand hovered near the small of her back, felt off. I shook it off. It was just a picture, after all. But as I dug deeper into the shoebox, I found more. Text messages, printed and folded into neat squares, each one from Ethan to Mia. They weren't overtly incriminating, but there was a familiarity in the tone that didn't sit right. "Hey, thinking about you. Miss our talks. Last night was amazing. Thank you." My hands trembled as I sifted through them. The words blurred, the meaning behind them hitting me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't the perfect marriage I thought we had. This wasn't the brother I thought I knew. The perfect picture had begun to crumble. The shoebox remained in my hands, its weight far heavier than its physical form. I closed the lid and stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Each scrap of paper inside was another jagged shard, cutting into the image I had crafted of my life. I knew I couldn't jump to conclusions. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe I was overreacting. But the part of me that craved logic and reassurance was drowned out by the rising tide of doubt. Mia returned home a few hours later, bags from the grocery store dangling in her hands. She called out a cheerful greeting, her voice echoing through the house. I stayed in the attic, silent, unsure of what to say or even feel. Eventually, I forced myself to go downstairs. Mia was in the kitchen again, unpacking the groceries with a casual ease that made my stomach turn. Her movements seemed too natural, too unbothered, as though she didn't carry the weight of guilt or deception. I stood in the doorway watching her, the shoebox still clutched in my hands. She turned and smiled at me. "Hey, what's that?" she asked, gesturing toward the box. "Found it in the attic," I said, my voice steady but tight. "Thought I'd sort through some things." Her smile faltered just for a second. A blink and you'd miss it moment, but I caught it. She turned back to the groceries, her voice airy. "God, I haven't looked through that box in years. Probably just old stuff from when we were dating." It sounded plausible. It sounded innocent. But now, every word she spoke felt like it carried another layer of meaning. Later that evening, while Mia cooked dinner, I texted Ethan. "Drinks on Friday still good?" His response was almost instant. "Of course. Can't wait." 8 p.m.? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. For the first time, I felt a flicker of anger. Not just at Mia, but at him. I typed a simple reply. "See you then." That night, lying beside Mia in bed, I stared at the ceiling while she scrolled through her phone. I wanted to ask her about the texts, about the pictures, about everything, but the words stayed lodged in my throat. Instead, I began to notice things I had ignored before. The way she angled her phone away from me, the frequency with which she checked her screen, her lips twitching into faint smiles. When she turned out the light and whispered goodnight, I stayed awake, staring into the darkness. My mind replayed the moments from the shoebox and twisted them into something darker, something undeniable. By morning, my resolve had hardened. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I needed more. The pictures, the messages, they could be explained away, twisted into something innocent. But if there was more, I would find it. And if there wasn't, I shoved the thought away. In the back of my mind, a bitter truth lingered. Nothing about this was innocent. Friday evening arrived, and with it came the knot in my stomach. Meeting Ethan felt like stepping onto the edge of a cliff, unsure if I'd jump or be pushed. Mia had kissed me on the cheek before I left, her usual warmth undisturbed. "Have fun," she said, her tone breezy, as if she hadn't shattered the foundations of my trust. I didn't reply, afraid my voice would betray me. Ethan was waiting at the bar when I arrived, leaning casually against the counter. He greeted me with his signature grin, the same one that had always earned him a free pass from trouble. "About time," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Thought I'd have to drink alone." I forced a smile, slid onto the stool beside him, and ordered a whiskey. My mind raced as we made small talk, Ethan effortlessly filling the gaps with anecdotes about work, mutual friends, and his latest fling. I played along, nodding, laughing at the right moments, but beneath the surface, my anger simmered. Finally, after our second round, I leaned back, feigning casualness. "How's your love life?" I asked, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. He raised an eyebrow, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Oh, you know me, keeping things exciting. Anyone special?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief it might have been missed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. Then he smirked. "Nah, nothing serious. You know how it is." I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him shift in his seat. "You've been spending a lot of time in town lately?" I said, keeping my tone light. "Mia mentioned running into you a few times." Ethan's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, shrugging. "Yeah, I guess. She's always around when I visit." Small world. Huh. My jaw tightened. The way he spoke of her, so dismissive, so casual, made my skin crawl. "Small world," I echoed. "You've always gotten along with Mia, haven't you?" His eyes flicked to mine, a hint of something unreadable in them. "Of course. She's great." "Why?" I shrugged, taking another sip of whiskey to buy myself time. "Just curious. You're around a lot. I wondered if you two hung out when I wasn't around." His laugh was forced, almost defensive. "What are you getting at?" "Nothing," I said, setting my glass down. "Just making conversation." Ethan leaned back, his casual demeanor strained. "You're acting weird, man. What's going on?" For a moment I wanted to lay it all out. The pictures, the texts, the shoebox. I wanted to demand answers, to see the guilt flood his face. But I stopped myself. "Nothing's going on," I said, forcing a laugh. "I'm just tired, that's all. Long week." He relaxed, buying the excuse. But I didn't miss the way his fingers drummed against his glass or the flicker of unease in his eyes. As the night wore on, Ethan's guard lowered again. He cracked jokes, relived old stories, and played the role of the perfect brother. But the cracks were there now, and I saw them every time he glanced at his phone or shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When we parted ways, I watched him walk to his car, his steps quick and deliberate. He was hiding something, and I was going to find out exactly what. The next morning, I woke with a clearer head and a sharper determination. Ethan had lied to me. I was sure of it now. But instead of confronting him, I decided to dig deeper. While Mia was out running errands, I searched the house. Not wildly, not like a man who had lost his mind, but methodically. I focused on the places she thought I'd never look. Her jewelry box, the back of her closet, the spare pockets of her handbags. It was in the drawer of her nightstand that I found it. A second phone. The case was bright red, something Mia would never choose for herself. I powered it on, my pulse hammering in my ears, and entered her usual password. The screen unlocked with a chime, revealing a string of texts. At the top of the list was a name that made my blood run cold. Ethan. I didn't read the messages immediately. Instead, I slipped the phone into my pocket and replaced everything just as I'd found it. When Mia returned, smiling and oblivious, I kissed her on the cheek and asked about her day. I smiled as she spoke, but the phone in my pocket burned like a live coal. Later, when she was asleep, I read the texts. In the dim glow of my study, I unlocked the red phone again, my fingers trembling. The messages were all there, each one a blade aimed at my heart. Ethan, you looked incredible last night. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Mia, you're too much. What if he finds out? Ethan, he won't. Just trust me. The timestamps told a story of late-night rendezvous and secret meetings. One message, in particular, stopped me cold. Ethan, next time, let's meet somewhere farther. I don't want anyone seeing us. I closed the phone, my vision blurring as the words replayed in my head. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was real, tangible. My brother. My wife. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel sadness or despair. I felt rage. A deep, primal fury. I had always trusted them both. Now they had destroyed that trust. And they would pay. The next day, I began to work, every move calculated. I wouldn't confront them, not yet. Revenge required patience, and I intended to make this betrayal unforgettable. I started by being kinder to Mia, more attentive. I cooked dinner that evening, made her laugh, and listened to her stories. She softened, her guard lowering. With Ethan, I acted the same, inviting him over for beers, reminiscing about old times. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. But beneath the surface, I was watching, learning. Every glance they exchanged, every slip of the tongue, was another piece of the puzzle. When Mia left the room during dinner that evening, Ethan leaned closer, grinning. You've been in a good mood lately. What's your secret? I smiled back, hiding the venom in my thoughts. Just appreciating the people who matter. He laughed, oblivious. But I wasn't lying. I was just leaving out the part where I planned to destroy them. Over the next week, I quietly set my plan into motion. I began tracking Mia and Ethan, paying attention to their movements. A phone tracker on the red device let me know when she left the house unexpectedly. And it wasn't long before I noticed a pattern. Most of her errands coincided with Ethan's free time. The tracker confirmed what I already knew but needed proof for. They were meeting. I waited for the right moment. When Mia told me she had a book club meeting one evening, I smiled and wished her fun. She kissed me, her touch light and carefree, and left. I followed. From a distance, I watched as her car pulled into a secluded parking lot. Moments later, Ethan arrived, stepping out of his car and embracing her. The sight of them together, laughing, holding each other, was a knife twisting in my chest. But I didn't let the anger control me. Instead, I took pictures. Evidence. Their betrayal would become the very thing I'd use to destroy them both. The following day, I made my move. I texted Ethan. Hey, thinking of throwing a surprise party for Mia next weekend. Need your help planning it. His response was quick and enthusiastic, a perfect mask for the lies beneath. Ethan. Of course. Anything for Mia. Just let me know the plan. I could almost hear his smirk through the screen. Meanwhile, I laid the groundwork with Mia. Over dinner, I casually mentioned that Ethan and I had been catching up more lately. He's been such a good brother, I said, watching for her reaction. Her fork hesitated mid-air, but her voice was steady. That's great. You two have always been close. Close. The word hung in the air, bitter and mocking. The trap was nearly ready. All I needed now was to pull them both closer. And when the time came, I would watch them fall. By the weekend, everything was in place. I told Mia I had to work late on Friday, giving her an excuse to spend the evening however she pleased. She didn't hesitate, her alibi ready as always. Ethan and I met earlier that day to plan the party. I brought a notebook, filled with fake ideas, decor themes, catering menus, even a guest list. He played along, offering suggestions, as if this was just another brotherly bonding moment. I'll handle the decorations, he offered, his smile wide. You focus on getting Mia there. I nodded, feigning appreciation. Thanks, man. She's going to love this. He had no idea. By the time he left, I had everything I needed. His phone had been left unattended just long enough for me to install a tracking app, the same one I'd used on Mia's secret device. Now I could monitor them both. And when the moment came, I would bring their world crashing down. On Friday evening, I made sure to work late, texting Mia periodically to keep up appearances. She responded with casual updates, claiming to be home relaxing, but the tracker told a different story. She was with Ethan. Using their locations, I confirmed they were at his apartment. My jaw clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the moment to strike. Not yet. Instead, I began putting the final pieces of my plan in motion. I contacted a friend of mine, an attorney who owed me a favor. Without revealing too much, I explained that I needed help gathering some evidence for an upcoming issue. He didn't ask questions, just agreed to meet me the following day. That night, I lay awake in bed, every fiber of my being screaming for action. But I reminded myself, patience. When the time came, they wouldn't just pay for their betrayal. They'd pay for underestimating me. Saturday morning, I handed the collected evidence, photos, screenshots of texts, and timelines of meetings, to my attorney friend. As he reviewed them, his expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. He assured me that it was more than enough to build a case if I chose to escalate things legally. I shook my head, signaling that this wasn't about courts or settlements, at least not yet. My focus wasn't on official justice. It was on something personal, something precise. Leaving his office, I felt the faintest trace of relief. The plan was nearing its final stages, and the control I'd wrestled back from the chaos strengthened my resolve. That afternoon, I reached out to Ethan, inviting him to meet the following evening. I framed it as a casual dinner, an opportunity to bond further. My message was carefully phrased, ensuring he wouldn't suspect a thing. By the time the arrangements were made, I knew this wouldn't just be another meal between brothers. It would be the beginning of his reckoning. Sunday evening arrived, and I met Ethan at a small, quiet restaurant. The place was intentionally chosen, discreet, out of the way, where no one would overhear what needed to unfold. Ethan greeted me with his usual easy confidence, unaware of the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. As we sat down, I steered the conversation toward light topics. Childhood memories, shared jokes, plans for the upcoming week. But as the evening wore on, I began to press, subtly probing into his life. I brought up Mia, casually mentioning how she'd been so busy lately. His reaction was measured, but there was a flicker of something, nerves maybe, that didn't escape my notice. He played it off, deflecting with a charm I knew too well, but I let the topic linger just long enough to unsettle him. I could see it in the way his posture shifted, his laughter a fraction too loud. I left the restaurant that night without making my move. Ethan still believed he was in control, still confident his secrets were safe. But now I was certain. Guilt had started to creep into his perfect facade. It was only a matter of time before the cracks split wide open. After the dinner, I intensified my quiet surveillance. Ethan's discomfort at my probing had confirmed I was getting under his skin. Now I needed to turn the screws. I began sending small, anonymous hints to both Mia and Ethan. Nothing overt, just enough to unsettle them. A message left on Mia's phone read, "Secrets don't stay buried forever." Ethan received an unmarked envelope containing one of the photos I'd taken of them together. No note attached. Their reactions were predictable. Mia became more cautious, her glances toward me wary and calculating. She'd started checking her surroundings more often, even in the safety of our home. Ethan, meanwhile, became visibly paranoid during our interactions, his usual charm faltering as he fidgeted and stumbled over words. Neither confronted me outright, but the tension between them was palpable. I watched as the betrayal that had bound them together began to erode their confidence. They were unraveling, piece by piece, and I was the invisible force pulling the strings. The following week, I set the final stage. I sent Mia and Ethan identical, and signed notes, each instructing them to meet at a secluded cabin I'd rented under a false name. The messages were simple but direct. "We need to talk. Come alone." I knew curiosity and fear would drive them to the location. They couldn't risk ignoring the summons, not when the weight of their guilt was already pressing down on them. On the chosen evening, I arrived at the cabin hours before they would. The place was bare and quiet, a single table and 2 chairs placed purposefully in the center of the room. I positioned a hidden camera to capture every angle, ensuring there would be no denials once this was over. I waited in the shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. First, Mia arrived, her face tight with anxiety. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes darting around the room. Moments later, Ethan appeared, equally tense, the same question written on his face. Why? As their eyes met, realization dawned. The confusion turned to panic as they recognized this wasn't a coincidence. It was a setup. Before they could escape, I stepped into the light. Their faces froze, first in shock, then in a flood of emotions I couldn't quite place. The confrontation had begun. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Ethan and Mia stood frozen, their guilt unmistakable as I took my place at the table. I gestured for them to sit. They hesitated but obeyed, their movements slow and cautious. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Instead, I laid the evidence on the table, the photos, the text transcripts, the recordings I'd captured. The weight of their betrayal was now inescapable, staring them in the face. Mia's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing, her lips trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing him. This wasn't about explanations or apologies. I wasn't here to hear excuses. Calmly, I explained how I'd orchestrated everything. The tracking, the surveillance, the anonymous messages. I laid bare the depths of their deception, stripping away any illusions they might have clung to. Their silence was deafening, but their faces told the story. The panic, the shame, the realization that their actions had finally caught up to them. I didn't yell or lash out. Instead, I delivered my final blow with cold precision. A detailed account of how I would dismantle their lives. Ethan would lose his job when certain incriminating photos found their way to his employer. Mia's reputation would crumble under the weight of public humiliation, the recordings and messages poised to make their rounds. And then, I stood, leaving the cabin without another word. I didn't look back at their broken expressions, nor did I need to. The drive home was silent, my mind blank. The revenge I'd planned for so long had come to fruition, but there was no satisfaction, no relief. Only the echo of what had been lost. They had betrayed me, but in the process I had destroyed us all.